hello everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you all today. I am Nick Anderson. I'm a growth consultant on the growth consulting team. And today I'm going to talk about something a little bit different, a different stage of the life cycle. Today we're going to talk about IP, specifically the question of, when to invest in developing an original IP or to leverage an established IP to gain an advantage. Up until recently when I joined Google, I had been in the game development and publishing space. So I'm extremely familiar with how intense this conversation can be. Before I begin, just want to get a quick show of hands in the last few years, how many of us have actually explored this critical question of developing a new IP or leveraging an established IP? Oh, great, great. So we're all very intimately familiar with this subject. In fact, probably having some conversations about that right now. Oftentimes the conversation is filled with a lot of tension. The tension between creative freedom or canon constraints, or the financial risks versus the market certainty that an IP might provide, or the challenge of audience building versus meeting the audience expectations. All of this conversation, all of this debate is generally in service of a key question. What is the outcome that I will get from making this choice? How will this choice impact my future, the future success of my game? And so our team took a few moments and we looked at the data available to us and we tried to develop some measures that could help you make this decision more confidently in the future. And so we'll start broadly and narrow down, hopefully providing a few new vectors to look at this conversation in the future. And we'll start with an easy one, monetization. So, straight away, the first thing that we saw was we began our analysis that established IP will provide a 6 times increase in consumer spend generally during the first year of operation. Now, you'll note here in the parentheses that I've highlighted that's the 75th percentile. This is a deliberate choice to eliminate many of the outliers that would potentially contaminate sort of the results. So all the data that we look at here is tangible and valuable for a broad audience. But let me visualize this a bit better. So when we look at this chart here, along the horizontal axis, we're looking at time, starting from day 0 to out over 5 years. Along the top, going up and down, we're looking at cumulative consumer spend. I apologize, cannot distribute the numbers for that particular thing. That being said, we can immediately see that there's a gap. Our light green line represents our established IP. And our dark green line represents our original IP. We can see straight away that from a global cumulative consumer spend basis, that there's a consistent gap between them. However, this did not quite feel like enough because on its face you'd go, oh, well, case is closed. Established IP is the way to go. But what if we move beyond this view? Because all we can really see here is an outcome. That's what the cumulative dollars will provide, but it doesn't really give us a sense of the influence that the IP might provide. Like, right now, it seems that it might be constant and steady, but we needed to get a real answer to move beyond the totals. We needed to isolate and truly measure the potency to understand that effect as a performance booster. So we thought, what if we treated established IP as a multiplier on a game's success, and how would that multiplier behave over time? To accomplish this, we created a new lens, a specific measure for this analysis, and originally I called it the established IP multiplier. It's a very straightforward ratio to calculate. We take the established IP divided by the original IP at the same point in its life cycle. We're able to strip away the raw dollars and see how the IP advantage or its potency will change over time. And when we applied this new lens, a more nuanced and clear picture began to emerge for us. We saw that, yes, as mentioned before, the boost from an established IP is incredibly potent, but as one might expect, it's also heavily front-loaded. This initial advantage shrinks extremely rapidly over the first 12 months before stabilizing at a lower and sustained level. So it isn't necessarily a constant advantage, but a launch accelerator. But we're looking right now at cumulative consumer spend, so what about installs? That's the next question. Does it effectively get people through the door in about the same pattern, at about the same shape? Well, let's take a look. Yeah, but it's not quite the same. There's a critical difference. The impact from an install perspective wanes dramatically quickly. In fact, by the 5th or 6th month, it's fallen below the baseline of an original IP. So yes, an established IP will get players in through the door, but it doesn't really guarantee a long-term acquisition advantage over a strong original IP. To put a number to it, effectively at its peak, an established IP is providing a 1.5 times increase in installs, concentrated in that narrow 6-month window that we saw before, technically even a little bit shorter. So what did we learn in this? We learned that, yes, established IP does provide a powerful but front-loaded boost to both IP and install performance, provided that, naturally, your goal is solving for market entry. You're trying to connect to a passionate and engaged fan base utilizing that IP. But given the facts that we learned that it's relatively short-lived, your core game must have strong appeal and engagement on its own if you're going to continue to engage and monetize players. And also provided you're able to select and acquire an IP that truly resonates with your audience. From a high level, right, the path seems clear. I'll get an established IP, I will make an amazing game, and all of the things will work. But as we continued to evaluate, we knew that we needed to look closer and ask a new question. Question being would be, what additional modifiers could we apply that would sort of supercharge that multiplier? What additional vectors influence the impact of the potency of the IP? And on that, and as we started to observe, we highlighted 2 key variables. The first being genre. We asked the question here as, does the potency of the IP change based on the type of game that it is? And second, we looked at market. Is an IP's power universal, or does it vary by region? The insights were shocking. But before I jump into the data itself, I'll lay out the information that we're going to be looking at for this analysis. So first, we will look at these things over 2 time periods. We'll look at the short term, which is launch, and the long term, which is about 5 years post. The second component of this is that we're going to look at a narrow band of genres. These genres were specifically selected given their diversity, relevance for this awesome group, as well as their diversity of game loops and business models. So we'll be looking at RPG, puzzle, strategy, and simulation. And when we contrast the launch and the 5-year post-launch, we're able to better clarify the kind of impact that we see with established IP. Now, to quickly orient to this relatively simple chart, right? Again, we're looking at our 4 categories along the bottom. In our lighter green line, we're looking at the at-launch period. At our darker green bar, we're looking at the 5 years post, right? This comparison of bars lets us see the boost and the durability. And as soon as we made this visualization, it's probably standing out to you, a couple of stories stood out straight away. The first one being strategy. Holy cow, look at that initial launch multiplier. It is extraordinarily strong. But then, what happened long range? Long range, it's vanished, almost neutralized in that period. Yeah, IP, the established IP, was clearly successful at bringing players into the game, but the boost itself was not enduring, which was in stark contrast to our second category right next to it. RPG, right? We see that it also has a very strong launch multiplier, about 2.8, almost 3 times, right? But when we look at the long range, well, what did you see? 2.2. It's almost as strong as its launch period. This generated some interesting hypotheses because we could see that unlike strategy, RPG's impact seemed to be durable. So we have these 2 initial stories that we'll focus on, and there are stark differences in the behavior and the response to this. So what does this tell us? What do we think? Well, we immediately hypothesize that Something that is distinct about here is that depending on your category, the IP's role changes. In some cases, the IP's role is better suited to acquisition, definitely driving people into your experience. However, in other cases, it seems to be very heavily tied to engagement. Looking at this again, our hypothesis here is that when we look at the strategy genre, which is a very systems-driven sort of category, IP really does serve as a great hook to bring people into the game. However, long term, that seems to be like mitigated and shifts into more of the system dynamics rather than the initial IP itself. Another contributing factor to that might be that in the context of a strategy game, when leveraging an IP, there is a distance for the player from the world and characters itself, which might have brought them in, right? Conversely, when we look at RPG, it seems to be very strong from an engagement perspective. Using that same example of player distance, the player distance to the characters and world is much closer, given that content-driven nature here, right? Effectively making it more durable because it's higher touch. So understanding whether the IP configuration associated to your given genre is compatible and whether it's best at driving acquisition or engagement will be a huge step forward. But as I mentioned before, we're looking at two categories. This is only half the equation. So let's step into our second multiplier or modifier. And that would be the market. And the question here again is an IP's power universal? Or does it vary? Does it change dramatically based on where you launch your game? And like before, it was a spectrum. And to understand it, we will be looking at two extremes over these examples. On one end of the spectrum, we'll have what I'll coin a high affinity market. In a high affinity market, cultural and brand relevance is of exceptional importance, and there is no better example of this than Japan. We can see here that the boost is 21 times. No one else comes close. It is key, what we learn here is that it is effectively essential to have a culturally relevant IP integrated into that thing. It is a critical business decision, right? But let's look on the other end of the spectrum. India, on the other hand, the multiplier is still affected. At the near term, we see a 2.5 times increase, right? So still relevant, but when we look long term, it's the first, technically second time we see it actually fall below 1. Why might this be? It may be similar to a previous example when we were evaluating strategy, that the core gameplay itself might be more of the determining factor or driving factor for that particular genre. So if we recap here, what did we learn? We learned that, well, hey, established IP's power is not really global per se. It varies based on market behavior, right? In high affinity markets like Japan, an established IP is effectively critical for success. Conversely, we look at a more brand agnostic place like India and Brazil. Also, while they will benefit short term, long term, it's the core game's quality that will truly win the day. At this point now, we've established two principles. The IP's role is defined by its genre, and that its power is defined by the market. But a successful strategy cannot really just consider these things alone and in isolation. The real insight often lies in the intersection, which is what we will explore now. To make sense of this complex intersection, we have segmented our results into 3 archetypes. We'll begin to go over them now. Our first segment that we're looking at is the loyalist group. In markets such as these, there's a high impact both immediately in the short term and is durable 5 years post-launch. Our next category would be the pragmatist, where, again, we see a modest to high impact at launch, but relatively low impact downstream. Our third group is the IP agnostic group. In this group, it's effectively a low impact either way you cut it, right? IP isn't necessarily the driving thing here. With this in mind, let's move forward and start to explore the framework in action. Let's see how it applies to our genres. And we'll start with puzzle. We can see here when we look at the distribution of audiences in the puzzle category, Japan and Korea show up in our loyalist category. But in our pragmatist category, the US, Germany, Brazil, and India show up. What this says to us is that in this particular category for Japan and Korea, an IP is essential. The familiarity will drive that engagement and ultimately consumer spend. However, for the US and potentially these other regions, it only really serves as a launch accelerator. This might be due to competition or other factors, but it's something to consider. But let's move on to our next category. Strategy. Again, we have in our loyalist category, Japan. Japan is represented. But when we move on again, we see that all other geos that we covered have fallen into the pragmatist role. This actually follows the model that we saw before, where we saw a tremendous boost at launch, followed by a much more muted performance long term. And now let's move to our final categories, simulation and RPG. Very different composition yet again. Whereas for RPG, we see Korea showing up in our loyalist category and Japan showing up in our pragmatist category. All other regions have fallen into the agnostic category, not necessarily truly respondent to IP on its own, right? And then again, we look at simulation and the story changes yet again, where we have effectively no loyalists for this particular category, right? The West broadly occupying the pragmatist realm and the agnostics largely being covered in APAC, which is extremely interesting. So what we learn here when we start to look at our markets and how they respond across the different categories is that like one can't simply have like I have a US strategy. You should have a US strategy, specifically, and figure out how you're going, what makes the most sense for you, for your business. So let's move on to the next lesson. The lesson is, we looked at each thing in isolation, but effectively, the IP's performance of your game is a function of both the market that it exists within and the genre that you're utilizing. So you cannot consider them in isolation. And success will lie in finding the perfect alignment for your particular launch strategy. Mismatches can lead to a flawed strategy and some unexpected results. A quick example, I'm developing a big RPG. I believe and I know that RPGs are going to drive long-term engagement. And I was thinking that the US was going to be my key market for this thing, but I've learned that it is agnostic to IP. So if I go and I license in that category, well, the market kind of neutralizes the long-term value that I would be paying for, so perhaps I should be investing in developing my own IP, right? Since a license in this scenario might be a less efficient investment. So, having gone through this, it's now much more clear to us that finding the intersection is a critical thing. It's the foundation of our data-driven IP strategy. But as we begin to finalize our research into this topic, we realize that there might be one more piece to this puzzle, one more multiplier, amplifier that could be the difference between good and great. And that is, it's the theme itself. What our given IP is about is just as important as just having an IP itself. For this, we'll do an exercise together. Imagine with me for a moment an IP. It's about a hard-boiled detective in a rainy city, and there's been a case, and it's very grim and gritty. Now hold that in your mind. Now, what game do you think best fits that kind of fantasy that I've outlaid for you, right? Hold that in your mind. I imagine it might look something like this. Hard-boiled narrative fiction game with interesting choices to be made, right? It's a perfect match of the theme and the genre, the mechanics speak to what the promise and central premise of what that IP that I described and you envisioned is. It delivers on the promise of the IP, right? But what if we ignored the promise of that IP? What if we just YOLO and we tried something else? Well, you might get something like this, which is an almost total mismatch. You know, while, yes, it is dark and it is gritty and there is the occasional car chase in a hard-boiled fiction story, it's not necessarily the right fit. But let me be clear. This isn't to say that experimentation isn't a good thing. It is, but the most successful experiments generally elevate the source material or references, not ignore it. And to fulfill my AI quota, both of these images were made utilizing Nano Banana. So with this in mind, our team being our team, we couldn't not make a chart and try to quantify the value of this. So let's explore the impact of theme. And to do this, we'll evaluate it from two perspectives, one being the market volume. This is effectively a measure of the frequency or rate of top-performing games that are utilizing a given theme. It gives us a sense of the popularity or saturation. But, you know, as I said, two measures, and popularity simply isn't enough to judge whether you should do something, because a theme could be crowded but not lucrative. So the second angle, we'll look at monetization strength, right? Looking at the monetization strength here is effectively like the average spend for the top games of a particular theme, right? With our powers combined, we can see the market's potential. Is this theme a niche but highly monetizable theme, or is it a broad and less lucrative one? Our power is in the synthesis. So let's see what it looks like in practice with our powers combined, focusing on role-playing games in the US. As we can see here, the US shows an extremely strong preference for the theme of fantasy and mythology, right? With its performance or spend about the average, all things said, right? Conversely, we see superhero and comics on the bottom right. There are very few games in this category, and its average spend is much higher, potentially signaling either an opportunity or a challenge. But as we looked at before, let's contrast this with another region and see how this changes. If I bring in Japan and overlay it, the preferences couldn't be more different. In fact, in Japan, that particular region is dominated by anime and East Asian folklore, right? Versus the West's preference for fantasy and mythology themes. Also notably, we'll see that science fiction has a much lower representation here, and superhero and comic worlds have completely fallen off in reference to Japan. When we overlay these things on top of one another, we can see how deeply the theme is also tied to the local market. So our takeaway here is theme is a unifying amplifier. It bridges your genre and your market. Our genres are how players will want to play, and our market will inform us of where our potential fans are, but our themes provide our players a reason to care, which brings us sort of back to the beginning, the big question. Well, what do I choose? Do I still go the established IP route, or do I develop an original one? And after all of this data and all of this talking, the answer is, it depends. But we know what it depends on, right? We have more of a sense of what it depends on, and it somewhat depends upon your goals as a studio, right? Like, so you can choose an original IP if the strength of your studio is the unique vision that you have and your ability to create new worlds and develop audiences. And in order to do that, your studio requires total creative control to execute on that vision. And your risk tolerance is high, right? But for the promise of the uncapped long-term value, conversely, you can choose an established IP if the strength of your studio is, flawless execution, and you're capable of delivering on the promise of a beloved world, and your studio is aiming for that powerful market entry that we saw. And our risk tolerance is that, is high for that execution risk there. So there are two paths that one can take here, each defined by your studio strength, tolerance, and goals. But what ultimately was revealed as we evaluated all of this is that your choices and your success is really built on the exact same foundation. Because really, no matter what choice you choose, you have to explore the questions and elements that we've stepped through today. We need to understand the core fantasy or themes, right? This represents the blueprint of what it is that we're going to build. What are the jobs to be done for our audience? And once we understand what those jobs to be done are, then we go, well, do we understand what genre, right, will meet the fantasy where it is, right? This is our tools and materials, right? And now we've built we've built this beautiful thing, and now we need to find the perfect location for our creation, right? And that's the market. Do we understand what markets the IP is resonant in, right? Where will this unique combination that we have formed will be celebrated and rewarded? It's a bit like an equation that I've painted out here, right? It's like we have our blueprint, our theme, our tools, our genre, our location, and ultimately have formed a successful IP strategy. So the answer to revisit it is perhaps that we've been asking the wrong questions. It isn't if you should use an IP or not, but why and how and where you should do it to achieve your specific goals. I hope this information that I've been able to share with you today, these data, this principles is useful, provides a useful framework for you as you continue on to navigate this conversation in the future. Thank you so much for your time, and I wish you all enduring success.